I always thought my life as a truck driver was pretty simple. Climb into the truck, follow the route, deliver the cargo, and head back home. 10 years on the road, and I believed I had seen it all. Storms, accidents, even desperate people hitchhiking in remote places. I was never easily scared. After all, being behind the wheel of a multi-ton vehicle made me feel in control, immune to the adversities that arose around me. That was until I changed jobs. It all started when Jake, an old friend from the road, convinced me to leave my old job. He talked about a new company that paid very well, more than any other I had ever known. In tough times, who could resist? I practically begged him to recommend me, and within less than a week I was already attending an interview. I expected the usual questions: experience, accident history, how long I could drive without stopping. But what I got were strange questions, ones that made me uncomfortable. Have you ever left your vehicle stopped in the middle of the road for any reason? Are you afraid of the dark? Are you religious? Each question seemed more absurd than the previous one, but I answered honestly. At that moment, all I wanted was the job, and the promise of a good salary made up for any awkward situation. The interview ended quickly, and I left with the job secured. I should have paid more attention to the details, to the hidden meanings in that meeting. But who would have thought that seemingly harmless questions could conceal something so deep and dangerous? My first job was to transport jerky to an isolated village. Nothing unusual there. The problem was that the delivery could only be made at night. That wasn't new to me. Many of my jobs involved driving through the night. But the tone of the instructions made me uneasy. The trip had to be completed before dawn, no exceptions. Additionally, Jake mentioned that the GPS wouldn't work in the area, something that already seemed strange. How in 2021 could a GPS not work on a road? Before I set off, Jake pulled me aside. "Paul, when you're on the road, I want you to listen to an audio I'll send you. Don't open it now, only when you're alone, okay? It's important. Trust me." I nodded, trying not to show the discomfort I felt at the seriousness of his voice. Jake had never been this serious in our conversations. He was always the laid-back type, laughing even at the gravest problems. But that night, something about him seemed different. I climbed into the truck, started the engine, and followed his instructions. When I reached the point where the road stretched for miles of desert ahead of me, I opened the audio. Jake's voice sounded calm, but there was a seriousness in his tone that I had never noticed before. He started off casually, almost as if giving normal driving advice. "Hey Paul, welcome to the company. I know you've got road experience, but here, things are a little different." There was a pause, and his voice seemed to tighten. "There are some rules you need to follow on this route. I'm not kidding, man. Follow each one to the letter and maybe you'll make it to the end." That gave me chills. Jake never spoke seriously, never seemed worried about anything, but now his voice carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. "The first thing you need to know is, keep your high beams on at all times. I know it sounds obvious, but this road is different. Even with the lights on, you'll notice it's dark. Really dark. It'll bother you, but don't turn off the lights. No matter what happens." I turned up the volume as I passed the first bend. The night was clear, the sky full of stars, but something about the darkness felt denser, more oppressive. I kept listening. Within the first 10 miles, you'll see a sign that says, "Callejón sin salida." Ignore it. Keep going. The lights might start flickering around that point. If they do, speed up. No matter what, just speed up until they stop flickering. That made me laugh nervously. Flickering? Speeding up? It sounded like something out of a bad horror movie. But even as I laughed, something inside me started to feel the weight of Jake's words. I kept listening. "You might see an old man on the road hitchhiking. If he says he's headed to the nearest village, let him in. But if he says anything else, speed up and don't look back. If he gets in, he'll stay quiet for about an hour, then ask to be dropped off in the middle of nowhere. Let him out, but don't look at him as you drive away. Just keep going." My laughter died in my throat. The idea of picking up a hitchhiker in the middle of the desert was unsettling enough, and the way Jake talked about it, as if it were a common occurrence, made my stomach churn. But I decided to keep going. After all, it could all just be a big prank. The road ahead of me was long and empty, a straight line cutting through the barren desert. Time seemed to drag on, and as I passed the initial miles, The darkness around the truck seemed to grow thicker, as if the stars in the sky were disappearing, one by one. The moon, which had once cast a soft glow over the asphalt, now seemed like a pale imitation of light, unable to penetrate the oppressive darkness surrounding the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing only absolute emptiness. There were no other vehicles on the road, no distant lights from farms or small towns. Just me, the truck, and the vastness of the night. Soon, I spotted the sign Jake had mentioned, Callejón sin salida. It was a rusty piece of metal, hanging by a single crooked nail. I ignored it, as he had instructed, but then, the truck's lights began to flicker. For a moment, my heart skipped a beat, and I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. The lights blinked off and on rapidly, and my mind immediately recalled what Jake had said. Speed up. I didn't wait to see if the lights would stabilize. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, the engine roaring louder as the truck picked up speed. The lights continued to flicker for a few more seconds before they finally steadied, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Looking toward the horizon, the emptiness of the road seemed more threatening than before, as if something was watching from afar. I tried to shake off those thoughts, focusing on the road and Jake's words echoing in my head. But even though I tried to ignore it, an unsettling feeling began to creep into my mind, the feeling that something was wrong. I continued listening to the audio as the truck slowly pushed through the endless night. If you reach mile 20, you might hear noises coming from the back of the truck. They could be banging, scratching, even growling. Ignore them. No matter how loud they get, don't slow down, don't look back. Just keep your pace. I took a deep breath. I was at mile 18, and despite the growing discomfort, I hadn't heard anything yet. Jake continued. When you hit mile 30, if the radio is still on, turn it off. Just turning down the volume won't help. You need to shut it off completely. I ran my hand along the side of the dashboard, turning off the radio. Not that I had been listening to music before, but the idea of something interfering with the frequency made me tense. At mile 35, he continued, the radio might turn itself back on. If it plays music, lower the volume or turn it off again. But if it's static, there was a pause in his voice, as if he were debating whether to continue. If it's static, you need to stop. Pull over, turn off the engine, lie down on the seat, and close your eyes. No matter what you hear around you, do not open your eyes. You'll hear noises, banging on the roof, on the windshield. You might even hear the truck door open, but don't move. If you stay still long enough, it'll pass. Eventually the noises will fade, and when they do, look slowly at the window. If the glass is fogged, wait another minute. If it's not, you can keep driving. I wasn't laughing anymore. The dashboard lights shone with an uncomfortable intensity inside the truck, casting long shadows that seemed to distort and move at the corners of my eyes. My hands were sweaty on the steering wheel, my body rigid, trying to focus only on the road. Jake's voice still echoed in my mind, and with each new rule he mentioned, I felt the grip of fear tightening. At mile 50, you might see something running alongside the truck. No matter how fast you're going, this thing will keep pace. Jake's voice trembled slightly when he said this, a tone that hadn't been there before. Don't try to look directly at it. Focus on the road. If you make it past the third bend, it'll disappear. But if after the third bend it's still there, speed up as fast as you can and hope you're faster. Sweat dripped down my forehead now, stinging my eyes, but I didn't dare take my eyes off the road to wipe it. I was only at mile 25, but the description Jake had given of what was to come was gnawing at me. There was something in the details, the way he spoke about the creature, about the sounds, about not looking back, that made me feel like I was being watched, as if by saying those things, he was preparing me for something inevitable, a fate I couldn't escape. At mile 70, he continued, as the wind outside began to pick up in intensity. The truck might shut off out of nowhere. When that happens, don't look in the rearview mirror. It'll be tempting, you'll want to see what's there, but don't do it. Just try to restart the engine as quickly as possible, and when you do, drive away. No matter what, don't look back. The rearview mirror was like an eye in the back of my head, always there, ready to reflect whatever was coming. I had always hated that mirror for that reason. It was as if it amplified the fear that something might appear out of the void behind me. Something I didn't want to see but knew would be there, lurking. I took a deep breath, trying to concentrate. The desert wind howled around the cabin, growing stronger with each mile. Everything seemed darker now, the road being swallowed by the night, and the distant mountains, which had once been faint silhouettes, had disappeared completely. There was no more horizon, just a black blanket surrounding me. Jake's voice still played in the audio, increasingly tense. He knew what was waiting for me, and I no longer had any doubt that this wasn't a joke. At mile 80, you'll start to feel hot. Don't turn on the air conditioner. It won't work anyway. Just take off your jacket if you need to, but don't open the windows, no matter how hot it gets. Something outside will try to get in if you open them. And believe me, Paul, you don't want that to happen. I swallowed hard. The heat he mentioned began to manifest almost imperceptibly. The temperature inside the cabin was rising, slowly but steadily, despite the cold night outside. The discomfort was growing, as if the air was getting thicker, heavier, making it harder to breathe. I didn't turn on the air conditioner. I didn't dare disobey Jake's rules. They seemed absurd, even paranoid, but there was something in the details, in the way he spoke, that made my instincts scream to obey. Every second felt drawn out, as if time was slowing down along with the road that never seemed to change. I glanced briefly at the rearview mirror, purely out of reflex, but the darkness stared back at me, dense and impenetrable. Then, as I hit mile 30, something started banging on the back of the truck. The sound was dull, as if someone was pounding on the trailer with their fists. My heart raced, and I sat up straighter in my seat, instinctively looking into the rearview mirror. Of course, I saw nothing, just the endless darkness stretching out like a black hole, swallowing everything I left behind. But the pounding continued, rhythmic, as if something back there was trying to get out, or worse, trying to get in. Ignore the noises. I remembered Jake's voice, as clear as if he were sitting next to me. No matter how loud or persistent they get, don't slow down and don't look back. I sped up a little more, keeping a steady pace as he had instructed. The sound of the pounding continued, echoing through the empty road, growing louder with each mile I covered. My fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white, but I refused to look in the mirror again. If something was back there, I didn't want to know. The radio began to crackle with interference. A wave of static invaded the sound, making a high-pitched buzz fill the cabin. I remembered the next instruction: turn off the radio. Turning down the volume wouldn't be enough. I stretched out a trembling hand, trying to keep my focus on the road, and pressed the button to turn it off. But the buzzing didn't stop, as if something was interfering in a way that shouldn't be possible. I kept trying, but the noise wouldn't go away. Then, suddenly, the radio went silent on its own, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying. The banging on the trailer stopped at the same time, and the only sounds were the truck's engine and the wind outside. My hands trembled. I was trying to convince myself that all of this was psychological, some kind of stress induced by Jake's suggestions. But deep down, I knew that something beyond my understanding was happening. My headlights flickered again for a few seconds. My heart leaped into my throat. Again, I stepped on the gas pedal, and the truck surged forward with a loud roar, cutting through the wind of the night. Yet, that feeling of being watched persisted. I knew I wasn't alone. Something was out there in the darkness, just waiting for the right moment. When I hit mile 35, the worst happened. The radio turned on by itself, the volume at maximum. The sound that exploded inside the truck was pure white noise. Static. A chill ran down my spine. My instincts screamed, echoing Jake's voice in my mind. If you hear static, stop the truck immediately. I did exactly that. I pulled over to the shoulder, the truck swaying slightly with the inertia, and turned off the engine. The following silence was absolute, as if the sound from the radio had swallowed the night along with it. The emptiness of the desert seemed to pulse around me, almost as if it were alive, breathing on the edges of my perception. And then, I heard the first thump on the roof of the truck. It was as if someone or something was walking across the vehicle, the steps echoing metallically above my head. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I followed the instructions. I slowly lay down on the seat, my body rigid with fear, and closed my eyes. No matter what you hear, don't open your eyes, Jake's voice said in my mind. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent, moving from the roof to the hood. Something was scratching the metal, like long claws scraping against it. My breathing was quick and shallow, my body frozen with terror. I could hear the sharp sound of what seemed like nails dragging across the windshield, and I forced myself to keep my eyes shut, even though fear was consuming me. Then, I heard the truck door handle. It clicked with a metallic sound, and I knew without a doubt that something had opened the door. An unbearable smell invaded the air, a stench of rot, like decaying meat left out in the sun. I felt the presence enter the cabin, something large and heavy, as if it had to crouch to get through the door. I could hear its heavy breathing, like a deep growl, and something like claws scraping the rubber floor of the cabin. My body shook. I didn't dare move, even with the creature so close. It seemed to sniff around me, sensing my presence, but without touching me. Time seemed to distort in that moment, each second stretching out like an eternity. As I kept my eyes firmly shut, trying not to scream, the thing stayed there for what felt like forever, until finally, I heard the truck door slam shut with a loud bang. The sound of the door closing echoed inside the cabin like a gunshot. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, still frozen in absolute terror. My mind screamed at me to keep my eyes closed, to follow Jake's instructions to the letter. But now, with the creature outside the truck, the silence that replaced it was almost more terrifying than its presence. I could feel the rotten stench slowly dissipating, but the feeling of something lurking, invisible in the air, remained. I forced myself to breathe again, slowly and carefully. The wind outside howled through the cracks of the cabin, but nothing else moved. Little by little, I tried to regain control of my body, now rigid with fear, and remembered the last part of Jake's warning. With excruciating slowness, I opened my eyes. The inside of the truck looked the same. No sign of the creature, nothing out of place. But then, I turned my gaze to the driver's side window and saw that it was completely fogged. A knot of panic rose in my throat, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Wait another minute," Jake's voice said in my head. I didn't dare move. I stayed there, frozen, mentally counting the seconds. The silence was crushing, and it seemed like at any moment, something could jump out of the darkness around me. Every insignificant sound, the creak of the truck, the whistle of the wind, was amplified, making my heart pound in my chest. The seconds seemed to drag on. My body was still, as if paralyzed by some invisible force. I could hear the echo of my heartbeat reverberating in my head, desperately trying to keep my focus. Then, finally, I looked at the window again. The glass had cleared. An immediate sense of relief washed over me, but it was brief. Something inside me knew the worst wasn't over. I had to keep going, finish the route. The creature might have left, but there were still many miles ahead. Mile 35 had been a test, a trial, and I had barely passed. I restarted the truck's engine with trembling fingers, and the sound of the engine roaring to life gave me a small, yet illusory, sense of control. The road was still ahead of me, and the next stretch, mile 50, would be crucial. The thing Jake had mentioned, the one that would run alongside the truck, seemed more real than ever. If what had just happened was true, then what was coming would be too. As the truck moved down the lonely road, I watched the darkness around me with frantic attention. The headlights were like thin blades cutting through an impenetrable black veil. I knew something could appear at any moment, but I didn't know what. Jake's voice repeated the warning, now etched into my mind. No matter how fast you go, that thing will keep up with you. The miles passed slowly, as if time itself was distorted on that endless road. My eyes were fixed on the lane ahead, but my ears were tuned to any sound from outside. Whatever was coming, I knew I couldn't face it, head on. At mile 47, I began to feel a strange vibration in the steering wheel. At first, I thought it was something with the truck, maybe a bump in the road. But then, I realized it wasn't just mechanical. Something was getting closer. I restarted the truck's engine with trembling fingers, and the sound of the engine roaring to life gave me a small, yet illusory sense of control. The road was still ahead of me, and the next stretch, mile 50, would be crucial. The thing Jake had mentioned, the one that would run alongside the truck, seemed more real than ever. If what had just happened was true, then what was coming would be too. As the truck moved down the lonely road, I watched the darkness around me with frantic attention. The headlights were like thin blades cutting through an impenetrable black veil. I knew something could appear at any moment, but I didn't know what. Jake's voice repeated the warning, now etched into my mind. No matter how fast you go, that thing will keep up with you. The miles passed slowly, as if time itself was distorted on that endless road. My eyes were fixed on the lane ahead, but my ears were tuned to any sound from outside. Whatever was coming, I knew I couldn't face it head on. At mile 47, I began to feel a strange vibration in the steering wheel. At first I thought it was something with the truck, maybe a bump in the road, but then I realized it wasn't just mechanical. Something was getting closer. At mile 48 I heard a distant sound, like a faint thudding, blending with the sound of the wind. The vibration in the wheels intensified, and I could tell the noise was coming from outside, not from behind the truck, but from somewhere on the side, running next to me. I gripped the steering wheel and stayed focused. Don't look, just keep your eyes on the road. That's what Jake had said, and so far, his instructions had kept me alive. At mile 49, the sound grew louder. Something was running alongside the truck, and now I could hear it clearly. It was a heavy sound, like large paws pounding the asphalt, yet still agile, as if made of pure speed and force. Curiosity tried to overcome me, the instinctive need to look and confirm what it was, but I knew I couldn't give in. At mile 50, the creature finally appeared at the edge of my peripheral vision. I didn't look directly at it, but I could feel its presence, enormous and unsettling, keeping pace with the truck. The absolute terror of being alongside something that shouldn't exist took hold of me, but I kept my eyes fixed ahead. Keep going, just keep going. Jake's words were now my mantra. The truck roared down the road, and the creature ran with disturbing ease, even with the speedometer showing over 90 km/h. I knew the only way to escape it would be to pass the 3 bends Jake had mentioned. The first bend appeared ahead, like a promise of escape, but also of danger. I slowed down just enough so the truck wouldn't skid, but kept going as fast as I could. As I made the turn, I felt the vehicle's weight shift, and my heart leaped when I heard the sound of the creature's paws scraping against the asphalt, trying to keep up. As soon as I passed the bend, I glanced briefly in the rearview mirror without looking directly, and saw the creature's shadow momentarily disappear, as if it had lost its footing for a second. Just 2 more bends, I thought, my heart pounding. The second bend came shortly after, and again, I did my best to maintain speed without losing control of the truck. I felt the vehicle sway, and the vibration in the steering wheel lessened. The creature was struggling to keep up, but it was still there, running as if its very existence depended on catching me. The third bend was the final barrier between me and escape from that thing. I didn't hesitate. I pressed down on the gas pedal as hard as I could, the engine roaring furiously as the truck tilted slightly while making the last turn. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my arms ached. My whole body was tense, waiting for the sound of the creature to disappear. Finally, after a second that felt like an eternity, the sound of paws hitting the ground stopped. It was gone. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The relief was so sudden that I almost stopped the truck. But I knew it still wasn't safe. I couldn't stop. Not until I completed the entire route. Jake had mentioned another series of horrors waiting for me, and I couldn't afford to relax now. There were still many miles ahead. With the truck speeding again in a straight line, the emptiness around me seemed deeper, as if the world around me was slowly being sucked into a vortex of darkness. There were 20 miles left until the next trial, and I knew each one would be a battle against the growing terror inside me. When I finally reached mile 70, something changed. The truck shut off. The engine died suddenly, and all the cabin lights went out, leaving me in complete, suffocating darkness. The silence was immediate and absolute, as if the world around me had ceased to exist. My eyes widened in total darkness. The only thing I could still hear was the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. With trembling hands, I tried to restart the engine, but nothing happened. The truck was dead, and I knew what was coming next. "Don't look in the rearview mirror," I repeated to myself, as if the words were a shield against what was approaching. I could hear footsteps, many. They were moving toward the truck, coming from all directions, like a silent army surrounding the vehicle. Figures were running toward me and every part of my body screamed to look. But I didn't look. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that I could barely feel my fingers. Cold sweat dripped down my face as I desperately tried to turn the ignition again and again. Panic was taking over, but I knew that looking at those things would be the end of me. Jake had warned me, don't look at them. Finally, the truck's engine roared back to life, and with a desperate push, I hit the gas, leaving the figures in the darkness behind me.